Breaking tonight, Australia's strategic patience just paid off spectacularly. Brussels didn't compromise, they capitulated. The setup when trade negotiations become power plays tensions are building across the Indo-Pacific tonight. Australia demanded genuine market access from the European Union through a comprehensive free trade agreement, but instead of quick concessions, Canberra walked away from the table entirely in 2023. Everyone believed Australia's smaller economy would force acceptance of whatever terms Europe offered. Financial analysts expected Canberra to cave on agricultural protections within months. Brussels assumed Australia would prioritize any deal over no deal. They were all utterly incorrect. Brussels, this week, standing alongside EU Trade Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič and Agriculture Commissioner Christophe Hansen, Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell made a statement that reverberated across European capitals. Australia will not sign an agreement unless our agricultural producers receive significantly increased market access. Our national interest is non-negotiable. Translation: Canberra just told Brussels that Australian sovereignty over trade policy cannot be purchased with symbolic gestures. And what happened next? The trading bloc that spent years protecting its agricultural subsidies reveals exactly why Australian determination is reshaping Pacific-European relationships while traditional negotiating assumptions collapse. The conflict, 3 years of strategic deadlock, dear viewers, between 2023 and early 2025, something extraordinary happened in Australia-EU trade negotiations. Brussels demanded too much. Canberra said no. And Australia, patient and professional, became the partner Europe realized it desperately needed. Let me explain exactly what broke down in 2023. The European Union arrived at negotiations with a fundamental assumption Australia would accept limited agricultural access in exchange for broader market entry. Brussels offered token quota increases for beef and lamb exports while maintaining massive tariff barriers protecting European farmers, receiving billions in agricultural subsidies annually. Canberra's response was devastating in its simplicity. No deal is better than a bad deal. The negotiations collapsed spectacularly. But here's what European officials didn't anticipate: Australia wasn't negotiating from desperation. While the EU represents a 450 million strong market and ranks as Australia's third largest trading partner collectively, Canberra had been systematically diversifying trade relationships across the Indo-Pacific. Our ACEP membership provided Asian market access. The India-Australia Economic Cooperation and Trade Agreement opened massive opportunities. The UK Free Trade Agreement delivered post-Brexit advantages. Australia could wait. Brussels, watching global economic fragmentation accelerate and the Trump administration's tariff assault destabilize traditional trade patterns, discovered it could not. The sticking points where sovereignty meets subsidies, the obstacles weren't merely technical. They represented fundamental questions about economic sovereignty and market fairness. First, agricultural protectionism. European farmers receive extraordinary subsidies from Brussels. Australian farmers compete in genuinely open markets without comparable government support. When Europe demanded Australia accept minimal quota increases while maintaining tariff walls, Canberra recognized this wasn't negotiation, it was preservation of European market distortions at Australian expense. Trade Minister Farrell has been adamant throughout Australia will not sign a deal unless the EU agrees to tear down tariff barriers to larger quantities of agricultural exports such as beef and lamb. Second, geographical indicators. Brussels wanted legal authority to prevent Australian producers from using terms like Feta and Prosecco. This wasn't about protecting European heritage. This was about using intellectual property claims to limit Australian market competitiveness for products that have become generic internationally. Translation: Europe wanted to copyright cheese terminology while refusing genuine market access for Australian agricultural products. Third, asymmetric demands on regulatory alignment. Negotiations covered working rights, labor mobility standards, and Australia's luxury car tax. Brussels approached these discussions expecting Australia to conform to European regulatory preferences. Canberra insisted on mutual accommodation respecting Australian policy autonomy. One outstanding issue now remains, believed to be connected to red meat exports, requiring final resolution between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and EU President Ursula von der Leyen. The turning point when Brussels blinked this week in Brussels, the negotiating dynamic shifted fundamentally. Don Farrell flew to Belgium for direct talks with Šefčovič and Hansen. The joint statement afterward was carefully diplomatic, describing discussions as constructive and positive, where both sides converge positions on a range of issues, with good progress achieved in narrowing gaps on a small number of outstanding matters. Read between those diplomatic lines. Converge positions means Europe moved toward Australian requirements. Narrowing gaps means Brussels offered concessions. Small number of outstanding matters means Australia's core demands were substantially accepted. The commissioners are now taking proposals to von der Leyen for sign-off. The EU president is widely expected to travel to Australia to sign both the free trade deal and a separate security partnership. Translation: Brussels is coming to Canberra because Australia won the negotiating endurance contest. Why this matters: strategic architecture beyond trade numbers. This isn't just about tariff schedules and quota allocations. This is about Australia establishing a template for how middle powers engage major economies on genuinely equal terms. Consider what Canberra accomplished first: credible walkaway power. Australia demonstrated that diversified trade relationships create genuine negotiating leverage. When Brussels assumed Australia needed Europe more than Europe needed Australia, Canberra's willingness to collapse talks in 2023 shattered that assumption permanently. Second, patience as strategy. While Europe faced escalating pressures from global economic fragmentation and Trump's tariff chaos, Australia used time strategically. Each passing month increased European incentives to conclude an agreement while Australian alternative relationships strengthened. Third, linking economic and security relationships. The simultaneous negotiation of trade and security partnerships created mutual reinforcement. As China's economic coercion toward Australia demonstrated the value of diversified security partnerships, Europe recognized that reliable Indo-Pacific partners required fair economic terms, not just strategic rhetoric. Senator Farrell said he was confident both sides would reach agreement that benefits both of our economies, adding any agreement must be in Australia's national interest and provide real benefit for Australian business, producers, exporters, and workers. That statement represents a fundamental shift in how Australia approaches major power relationships. National interest is non-negotiable even when negotiating with economies 10 times larger. The opposition when farmers fear fair competition. Fascinatingly, resistance emerged from identical sources on both continents. Australian farmers' groups have been fiercely critical of Europe's generous agricultural subsidies, urging the federal government to reject any deal that does not provide significantly increased access for Australian agricultural exports. European farming lobbies warned the pact should not expose EU farmers to intensified competition in already fragile markets. Translation: protected farmers on both sides fear fair competition from efficient producers. This opposition reveals exactly why this agreement matters. Genuine free trade threatens entrenched interests benefiting from government protection. Australian agricultural exporters, competing globally without massive subsidies, want market access based on product quality and competitive pricing. European farmers, dependent on billions in annual subsidies, want continued tariff protection preventing that competition. Brussels ultimately sided with consumers in strategic partnership over agricultural protectionism. That choice signals profound shifts in European trade priorities. The strategic context trade architecture in a fragmenting world. This agreement doesn't exist in isolation. It represents Australia's systematic construction of economic relationships, insulating against coercive pressure while maximizing market access across multiple regions. Consider the pattern. China imposed trade restrictions targeting Australian exports. Australia diversified markets and sustained agricultural sector performance. The UK sought post-Brexit trade partners. Australia secured a comprehensive agreement on favorable terms. India needed trusted technology and resources partnerships. Australia delivered both through ECTA. ASEAN required stable middle power engagement. Australia intensified relationships through RCEPP. The United States demanded deeper critical minerals integration. Australia negotiated partnerships protecting sovereign control. Now Europe, watching global economic fragmentation accelerate, recognizes that reliable Indo-Pacific partners with diversified relationships and genuine autonomy provide more valuable partnerships than economically dependent nations vulnerable to pressure. The Australia-EU Free Trade Agreement strengthens both parties precisely because it emerges from mutual respect rather than asymmetric dependence. What happens next? Implementation and implications. Von der Leyen's expected travel to Australia for signing ceremonies will represent more than diplomatic protocol. The EU president coming to Canberra, rather than requiring Australian officials to travel to Brussels, symbolizes the equal partnership this agreement represents. Implementation will require both sides to navigate domestic political pressures. European farmers will resist increased Australian agricultural competition. Australian producers concerned about European subsidies will demand enforcement mechanisms ensuring fair competition, but the broader strategic implications extend far beyond agricultural quotas. First, template for middle power trade strategy. Australia demonstrated that patient, principled negotiation from positions of genuine autonomy produces better outcomes than rushing toward any agreement. Other middle powers will study Canberra's approach. Second, reinforcement of rules-based trade architecture. Amidst Trump's tariff chaos and rising protectionism, the Australia-EU agreement signals that comprehensive trade liberalization remains achievable when partners negotiate in good faith. Third, Indo-Pacific strategic depth for Europe. This agreement, combined with the separate security partnership, represents Europe's recognition that Indo-Pacific engagement requires substantial economic integration, not merely strategic declarations. Australia's government will rightly claim this as a major win. GDP impacts from increased market access to 450 million European consumers will be significant. Agricultural exporters will gain opportunities denied during years of negotiating deadlock. But the larger victory is definitional. Australia established that middle powers with diversified relationships, strategic patience, and clear national interest priorities can negotiate major trade agreements on genuinely equal terms with economies 10 times larger. The revelation sovereignty is strategy, dear viewers. This is the fundamental lesson from 3 years of Australia-EU trade negotiations. Economic sovereignty isn't weakness requiring protection through closed markets. It's strength enabling engagement from positions of genuine autonomy. Australia didn't win this negotiation by accepting European terms. Australia won by having credible alternatives, strategic patience, and absolute clarity that no deal is better than a deal undermining national interests. Brussels learned what Beijing discovered during failed economic coercion attempts. Australia cannot be pressured into agreements against its interests because Australian trade diversification creates genuine options. When von der Leyen travels to Canberra to sign this agreement, she won't be doing Australia a favor. She'll be recognizing that European strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific require partnerships with autonomous middle powers on terms respecting mutual sovereignty. That's the new architecture of international trade in an era of global fragmentation. And that's tonight's analysis of why Australia's approach to the European Union reveals exactly how middle powers navigate major power relationships when strategic patience meets principled negotiation. Because in the end, the countries that can credibly walk away from bad deals are the ones that ultimately sign good ones.